Hey guys, tonight I want you to lie back, let your shoulders drop, and walk with me into a very quiet farmhouse bedroom in the Missouri hills. Because this is where a 63-year-old farm wife, with pencil stubs and school tablets, quietly turned herself into one of America's most beloved authors. By the time we leave this story, you will have walked beside her from that first trembling page in 1930 to the moment, 13 years later, when 8 Little House books had reshaped how millions of readers imagined the American frontier. Tonight is not about the little girl on the prairie. Tonight is about the older woman at the writing desk. You are standing on a hill above Mansfield, Missouri in early 1930. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. Down the slope, a farmhouse sits under bare trees, its windows holding a soft and a steady glow. This is Rocky Ridge Farm, 40 acres that have slowly grown into 200, carved out of stony Ozark soil over more than 3 decades of hard work. Inside that house, in a small upstairs bedroom, a woman is sharpening cheap pencils from the dime store. Her hands are lined, her hair is white. She is 63 years old. Her name is Laura Ingalls Wilder. For most of her life, no one has called her an author. They have called her a farmer's wife, a dressmaker, a chicken raiser, a farm journalist if they were being generous. She left school after what we would call about 9th grade. She never went to college. She has never typed a book. She's never seen her name on a dust jacket. And yet tonight, there is a stack of lined school tablets on the table in front of her. Empty pages, faint blue lines, the kind of paper a child might carry to a one-room schoolhouse. She settles herself, lays one hand flat to steady the tablet, and with the other she writes, in soft pencil, "Once upon a time." Not for a child, not yet. Not for a publisher, not yet. She is writing for herself, and for one other person, her daughter, Rose. You know her later as the woman who wrote Little House in the Big Woods and Little House on the Prairie. Tonight she is an aging farm wife in the middle of the Great Depression, trying to get 6 decades of memory onto paper before they slip away. Before you watch her write, you need to see what is already sitting in the room with her, even if you cannot see it. Behind her chair, in the air, are the winters and summers of a life that began far from these hills. Laura was born on February 7th, 1867, in Pepin County, Wisconsin, the second daughter of Charles and Caroline Ingalls. From the very beginning, her childhood was motion. Wisconsin woods, Kansas prairie on Osage land, a dugout in Minnesota, a hotel in Iowa, and finally the little town of De Smet in Dakota Territory. Her father was always chasing a better field, a better harvest, a better chance. The moves left a trail of cabins, claims, debts, and narrow escapes from failure. She worked from the time she was 9, helping on farms, sewing, doing hired work to keep the family afloat. At 15, in December 1882, she earned a rural teaching certificate and began teaching in one-room schools to send wages home. The books would later shift that date by 2 weeks for drama, but the record in Kingsbury County says December 10th, 1882. At 18, on August 25th, 1885, and she married a neighbour 10 years older, a capable young farmer named Almanzo Wilder. They tried to make a life on the Dakota Prairie, and disaster came one after another. Diphtheria that left Almanzo with a permanent disability, the death of an infant son after only 27 days, a house fire, and years of failed crops and debt. There was a year of recovery on his parents' established farm in Spring Valley, Minnesota. Then an experiment in Florida's heat that failed. Then a return to Dakota. And finally, in 1894, a last long wagon journey south to Missouri. There, near Mansfield, they bought a rough 40-acre farm with almost no money, but hundreds of young apple trees in the ground. They called it Rocky Ridge. For decades, writing was not a dream. Survival was. Laura raised chickens and sold eggs. She planted gardens, milked cows, took in sewing, saved every spare coin. When the apple orchard finally began to bear, the farm turned from hope to something closer to security. Only then did words begin to slip into the picture. Long before anyone called her a novelist, Laura was learning to write in the most practical way possible, in the farm paper. In 1911, in her mid-40s, she sent a piece to the Missouri Ruralist, a regional paper for farm families. It ran under her husband's initials, A.J. Wilder, but the sentences were hers. By 1917, she was the home editor, signing as Mrs. A.J. Wilder, writing about canning, war rationing, rural politics, and the stubborn dignity of farm women. She learned to hit word counts, meet deadlines, speak clearly to ordinary readers, and turn the grind of rural life into short, steady, useful essays. Between 1911 and the mid-1920s, she published more than 100 pieces for the Ruralist. These weren't stories about log houses and long winters. They were about price shocks, chicken breeds, and how to stretch a dollar. But they were training. She was building voice, rhythm, and confidence every time she mailed a column off to the editor in Springfield. In 1915, visiting Rose in San Francisco, she drafted more work for city newspapers under her own name. Laura Ingalls Wilder, and Rose, already a successful journalist and biographer, gave blunt professional advice. By the end of the 1920s, Laura had done something very few women of her generation ever did. Without formal schooling beyond adolescence from a farm kitchen table, she had quietly become a working writer. Not the kind of writer whose name people recognized in New York, but the kind of writer whose words farmers recognized when they unfolded the paper at breakfast. Then the world around her shifted. Her father, Charles, had died in 1902. Her mother, Caroline, died in 1924. Her elder sister, Mary, the gentle sister who had gone blind as a young woman, died in 1928. With each loss, another keeper of the Ingalls family stories disappeared. The memories of log cabins, blizzards, grasshopper plagues, and fiddle tunes moved a little closer to vanishing with them. At the same time, her own regular column at the Missouri Ruralist was winding down in the mid-1920s. The busy years of weekly deadlines eased. There was quieter in the farmhouse, more time to think, and more awareness of time passing. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. By 1930, banks were failing. Magazine advertising was collapsing. Publishers were cutting new titles and letting employees go, and whole families were losing farms at the courthouse steps. Book sales dropped so sharply that, as one trade statistic often quoted in later history suggests, only a small handful of authors in the United States managed to sell more than 50,000 copies in a year, a figure scholars now treat cautiously, because the original source is hard to pin down. It was, in other words, just about the worst possible moment for an unknown, elderly farm wife to decide she wanted to break into book publishing. And yet, for Laura, it was also the only moment left. She was in her early 60s. Her parents and Mary were gone. Her daughter was struggling financially despite past success. The family's income from farm products was not guaranteed. And the stories she'd been carrying since childhood, wolf howls in the Wisconsin woods, a log house on Osage land in Kansas, a dugout in a Minnesota Creek bank, the hard winter in Dakota, were still only in her head. You can almost feel the weight of that realization in the way she sharpens those pencils. If she does not write this down now, it will be lost. So, she begins, not with a children's story, not with a tidy scene for a library shelf. She writes what she calls Pioneer Girl, a straight chronological account of her life from about age 2 until her marriage at 18. She writes it the only way she knows how. On cheap-lined school tablets, in longhand, in pencil. Page after page fills with tight, careful script. She starts in the big woods of Wisconsin, follows the family wagon into Kansas, then on to Minnesota, Iowa, and Dakota territory. She writes the blizzards and the grasshoppers, the moves and the school terms, the hunger and the small triumphs. It is not yet a polished book. It is a life poured out, sometimes flatly, sometimes vividly, but always with the stubborn accuracy of someone who believes that getting the details right is a kind of respect. By the time she finishes, she has written roughly 74,000 words, nearly 400 handwritten pages. For a woman who has never written a book before, that number alone is a quiet act of defiance. Age, limited formal schooling, and a shaky publishing market have not stopped her from filling those tablets. On May 7th, 1930, she hands the completed manuscript to Rose. They're both living at Rocky Ridge then, Laura and Almanzo in a stone cottage Rose had built for them, and Rose in the original farmhouse up the hill. You can picture the moment. A mother in her 60s carrying a stack of tablets tied with string, a daughter in her 40s, already a nationally known writer who has profiled presidents and movie stars and written best-selling biographies and novels. They both know this is more than a stack of paper. It is a life, transferred from memory into graphite. From here, the story could have ended quickly. Rose types the manuscript. She sends it to her literary agent, George T. Bye, a powerful figure in New York publishing. It reaches the desks of magazine editors and book editors who, in a better economy, might have been more willing to take a chance. But 1930 is not a generous year. The verdict comes back. Too long, too flat in places, not enough high points or dramatic build. The adult market for frontier memoirs is crowded. Bye later summed it up with a comment that stings even now. To him, Pioneer Girl read like a kind old lady telling her life story in order, without enough sense of theatre. Editors liked some of the material. They did not see a clear way to sell it. One by one, magazines and publishers said no. Imagine Laura back in that upstairs bedroom hearing each rejection arrive. She has done what people are always encouraged to do. Write your story. And the answer from the professional world is more or less, thank you, but no. She is 63. There is no obvious second chance coming. If the story ended there, none of us would know her name. But the story does not end there. Because there is another writer in the house. Rose Wilder Lane is, by 1930, one of the highest paid women writers in the United States. She's written articles and semi-autobiographical pieces about figures like Henry Ford and Charlie Chaplin under her own byline. She has co-authored a biography of Herbert Hoover. She has written novels, travelled widely, and understands the New York publishing market in a way her mother never will. She reads Pioneer Girl not just as a daughter, but as an editor. She sees what the agents are seeing and what they are not. She knows that. The family stories are rich. The details of daily life are gold. And the adult memoir market may not be the right door. Quietly, without telling her mother at first, she begins to experiment. She pulls out some of Pa's stories from the Wisconsin years and stitches them into a short child-focused manuscript about when Grandma was a little girl. She keeps the cosy cabin, the fiddle, the butchering, the sugaring off, the sense of a small, complete world. She sends this shorter, child-centered version to an editor she knows, Marion Fiery at Alfred A. Knopf's children's department. In mid-February 1931, a letter arrives in Laura's rural mailbox from Knopf. It accepts a book she did not know existed. It praises a manuscript she's not seen. It asks for a 15,000-word expansion. You can almost feel her confusion holding that letter at her kitchen table. She has not written a children's book for Knopf. She does not know what they are talking about. She writes a polite, vague reply while she waits for Rose's explanation. When the explanation comes, when Rose points to the carbon copy tucked away in a file and says in effect, "I thought this might work better this way," there is likely a mix of emotions: gratitude, hurt, surprise, and perhaps a prickle of anger that a daughter has reworked a mother's life without asking first. But there is also an undeniable fact. For the first time, someone in New York wants a book with Laura's childhood in it. So, once again, she picks up the pencil. This time, she is not writing for adult readers, and not for herself alone. She is writing deliberately as if she were an outside narrator watching Laura the little girl. She shifts from I to she. She condenses and rearranges. She adds dialogue and sensory detail that a child would notice. The crackle of the fire, the sticky sweetness of maple sugar, the creak of wagon wheels in snow. The working title drifts from When Grandma Was a Little Girl to Little House in the Big Woods. The frame is the same Wisconsin cabin. The voice is gentler and more focused. It is still built from her memories, but it is now shaped with a clearer sense of story. While she's expanding this text for Knopf, the ground shifts again. In the fall of 1931, Knopf's children's department closes. The project looks as if it might die with it, until the manuscript reaches the desk of another editor, Virginia Kirkus, at Harper & Brothers. Kirkus reads the pages on a commuter train and becomes so absorbed that she reportedly misses her stop. Later, she'll say that reading it felt less like reading and more like listening. The older Laura behind the scenes and the little Laura in the story both felt alive. Harper does something daring for a company in the middle of the Depression. They do not just offer to publish the Wisconsin book. They offer a 3-book contract, betting that there are more stories where this came from. In April 1932, Little House in the Big Woods is published. Laura Ingalls Wilder is 65 years old. The farm wife with the 8th grade education is now, in the eyes of libraries and bookstores, a debut children's author. The book is chosen by the Junior Literary Guild, guaranteeing thousands of sales to member families and school libraries. Reviews praise its warmth, its detail, and its sense of honest, unsentimental nostalgia. That upstairs bedroom in the farmhouse, the one with the cheap tablets and the pencils, has just become the starting point of one of the most unusual late-life careers in American letters. From the outside, nothing much has changed. Laura still lives on a working farm. She still tends chickens, manages accounts, and cooks on a wood-burning stove. The country is still in the grips of the Great Depression. But inside that bedroom, and inside her own sense of herself, everything is different. She has proof now that the memories she carried are not just personal. They speak to something the wider country wants to hear. In a decade when families are losing homes and jobs, readers respond to a story about survival, steadiness, and making do in hard times. They recognise the comfort of a family that holds together through storms and scarcity. She also has a new kind of partnership with Rose. It is complicated, sometimes tense, a mix of maternal pride and professional friction. Laura writes her manuscripts in pencil, often producing multiple full drafts by hand. Rose types, revises, cuts, and sometimes reorganises. Editors in New York add their own marks. Through all that, one simple, stubborn fact remains. At an age when most people of her generation are thinking about rest, Laura has just started the hardest sustained creative work of her life, and she is not done. The Wisconsin woods are only the beginning. Harper expects more books, and quickly. Readers are already writing letters asking, what happened next? To answer them, she will have to revisit Kansas, Minnesota, Dakota, hard winters and near starvation, and weave them into new stories that children can carry to bed. She will have to navigate questions of truth and fiction, decide what to leave in and what to leave out, and work through a mother-daughter collaboration that no one outside the family fully understands. For a 63-year-old farm wife with failing eyesight and stiff hands, that would be enough of a challenge in any decade. In the early 1930s, with publishers failing and money tight, it is something like walking out onto thin ice and deciding to keep going. You've watched her sharpen her pencils, you've watched her write Pioneer Girl, survive rejection, and then pivot to a new kind of storytelling that will change her life. Now the question is simple. How, in the 11 years that follow, does she turn that first book into a full 8-volume saga that earns 5 Newbery Honours and becomes one of the most enduring children's series in American history? That is the journey we'll take next. The book arrived on shelves in April of 1932, and America picked it up. Not with the roar of a bestseller launch. Nothing about Laura Ingalls Wilder's entry into children's literature was loud. There was no publicity tour, no reading at a city bookstore, no newspaper photographer waiting outside her door. There was just a quiet farmhouse in the Missouri hills, a woman of 65 watching the road for the rural mail carrier, and somewhere in New York, a children's book editor who had bet her professional judgment on a farm wife none of the literary world had ever heard of. Virginia Kirkus's instinct turned out to be right. Little House in the Big Woods was selected immediately by the Junior Literary Guild, one of the major book clubs of the era that sent monthly selections directly to families and school libraries across the country. That selection did something no single review could accomplish on its own. It put Laura's Wisconsin childhood into the hands of children from Massachusetts to California, before word of mouth had even had time to build. It guaranteed a baseline of sales that, in the contracting economy of 1932, was as close to a sure thing as a publisher could ask for. The reviews praised the book's warmth, its unhurried detail, its sense of a world that felt both distant and intimately familiar. Critics noted that reading it felt less like consuming a story and more like being trusted with someone's memory. And then the letters started. In the decades she had spent writing farm columns, Laura had received occasional responses from readers, a note about a recipe, a comment on an opinion piece. Quiet acknowledgements from farm women who recognised something true in her words. This was different. The letters that began arriving at Rocky Ridge Farm in the spring and summer of 1932 came from children, from girls mostly, who had read about the little house in the big woods and wanted to know what happened next. Where did the family go after Wisconsin? Did they get a bigger house? Did Pa keep playing the fiddle? Did Laura ever see the wolves again? Children's letters tend toward the direct and the practical. They do not spend much time on literary appreciation. They want to know what comes next, and they want to know soon, and they are not shy about saying so. Laura read these letters carefully. She kept many of them. And they settled something in her that rejections and market calculations never quite could. There was an audience out there, a real one, made of living children who had stepped into her Wisconsin woods and were standing in them still, waiting for a door to open onto whatever was on the other side. She understood then, in a way she perhaps had not understood before, that she was not just filling a publishing contract. She was, unexpectedly, in the middle of a conversation. And a conversation has a momentum of its own. Here is the problem she faced immediately. The second book was not about her. Harper and Brothers, working from the 3-book contract, expected another manuscript. Laura was ready to write, but she had written the Wisconsin memories in sequence, and the story she wanted to tell next, the family's move to Kansas, just the little house on the prairie, was still crystallizing in her mind. Instead, in an unusual move that raised eyebrows even at the publisher, she wrote Farmer Boy first. Farmer Boy, published in 1933, is the odd book in the series. Its subject is Almanzo Wilder's childhood in upstate New York, not Laura's own frontier girlhood. It is set in Franklin County, New York, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, at a prosperous, well-managed farm that belonged to Almanzo's father, James. And the contrast between that farm and everything Laura had grown up in is so stark that it almost reads as an unconscious argument with her own past. The Wilder family farm in Franklin County was orderly, productive, and financially secure. James Wilder ran a diversified agricultural operation with healthy livestock, reliable harvests, and the kind of root-cellar abundance that the Ingalls family, with their perpetual moves and crop failures, could only have dreamed of. Almanzo's childhood memories, as Laura filtered and shaped them, are full of staggering quantities of food. Barrels of salt pork, smoked hams, rows of cheeses, crocks of pickled vegetables. Meals that would take a full paragraph to list. For a woman who had grown up watching her father borrow against next season's wheat, this must have been a peculiar kind of writing. She was recording a prosperity she'd never known from the inside. Not her memories, her husband's. And Almanzo, with his partial disability and the careful pace age had imposed on him, had to supply those details from the far end of his own life. Looking backward through 60 years of changed circumstances to a childhood that belonged to a body he could no longer fully claim. Laura worked from his recollections and cross-checked what she could. She built the New York farmhouse room by room in her sentences, furnished it with the facts he gave her, and then animated it with the writing instinct that was now unmistakably hers. The working method between the two books was becoming more practiced. Laura wrote her drafts by hand in pencil, typically completing 2 full handwritten drafts on yellow-lined tablets before the pages went anywhere near a typewriter. Rose then took over, typing, restructuring, trimming passages that ran long, sharpening dialogue that lay flat on the page. The manuscripts then travelled, sometimes by post when Rose was living away from the farm, We sometimes passed across a kitchen table when she was home, and Laura reviewed Rose's typescripts carefully, sometimes accepting the changes and sometimes pushing back against them in the margins. It was a working arrangement that functioned the way many close collaborations function. Not always smoothly, not always without friction, but with the particular productivity that comes when two intelligent people care deeply about the same outcome, even when they disagree about how to reach it. While Laura was building the series one yellow tablet at a time, the professional scaffolding around her was shifting in ways she could not fully control. Virginia Kirkus, the Harper & Brothers editor who had committed to the series with enough force to miss her commuter stop, left Harper in 1932. The children's department she had championed was now in other hands. Kirkus went on to found a book review service the following year in 1933, which she launched under the name Virginia Kirkus Bookshop Service. It would operate under various names for decades before eventually becoming the publication known today as Kirkus Reviews, a name it did not receive until 1969, 36 years after its founding. The loss of her direct editorial champion might have destabilised a less sturdy arrangement. But Harper was now commercially committed to the series, and a rising editorial figure named Ursula Nordstrom was beginning to build the children's department into something that would eventually make Harper one of the most respected names in American children's literature. The institution held even as individual people moved through it. Rose's role, meanwhile, was deepening in ways that complicated the simple picture of author and editor. She was often living at some distance from Missouri during these years, in New York and California, corresponding with Laura by letter rather than working at the same table. She was also writing her own fiction. Her novel Let the Hurricane Roar was published in 1933, also set on the Dakota frontier, drawing on the same territory of weather and hardship that Laura's books were mining. Two women, from two generations, writing two versions of what the American frontier meant, working sometimes in the same direction, sometimes at cross purposes, always within the pull of the same family memories and the same urgent need for the income those memories could generate. Laura received her royalty checks. She paid farm bills with them. She banked small amounts for security she had been trying to build her entire adult life. For a woman who had grown up in a family that moved whenever the debts got too high, having a regular income tied to her own name on a book cover was not a small thing. It was something she had not known was possible until it was already happening. In 1935, Harper published the third Little House book, and the one that would eventually give the entire series its most famous name, Little House on the Prairie. This is the book most people think of first when they hear Laura Ingalls Wilder's name. The wide open grassland, the half-dug-out house taking shape on a Kansas claim, Puss fiddle in the evening, the family entirely alone on the prairie making something from nothing, beholden to no one. It is also, when you look at it squarely against the historical record, the most complicated book in the series. Because the land the Ingalls family settled on in that book was not empty. It was Osage land. Specifically, it was within the bounds of the Osage Diminished Reserve in southeastern Kansas, territory the Osage Nation had been repeatedly pressured and manoeuvred into ceding, but which was, at the time the Ingalls family arrived in the early 1870s, still legally Osage territory. White settlers who moved onto the reserve did so illegally, squatting on land they had no legal right to occupy, in violation of the same federal treaties the government had already forced on the Osage. Charles Ingalls was not unusual in this. Thousands of white settlers were doing exactly the same thing across the region, ZST, wagering that the government would eventually formalize their presence and remove the native people. A wager that, in this case, turned out to be correct. The Osage were eventually removed from Kansas and relocated to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. But the book does not tell it that way. The book, written 60 years after the fact by a woman who had been a young child during those events, and shaped in the 1930s by an editor who understood the American children's book market, presents the prairie as open space, as possibility waiting to be claimed. The Osage men who appear in the book are filtered entirely through the eyes and feelings of Ma, who is afraid of them, and through a child who observes everything but understands very little of what she sees. Yea, what results is a portrait layered with the attitudes of a 1870s white settler family. Attitudes that included genuine fear, condescension, the good Indian versus bad Indian, thinking that was common in that era, and an almost complete absence of the Osage perspective on the people standing in their own homeland watching yet another white family nail up another claim shanty on their land. Laura and Rose were not blind to the complexity. Scholarly analysis of their correspondence shows that there was genuine debate between them during the editing of this book about how to portray the native characters, about Pa's more measured attitude versus Ma's open fear, about what level of nuance a children's book could carry. The evidence suggests they were aware they were walking a difficult line. They walked it anyway, in the direction the 1930s market required. Decades later, those choices would cost the book. In 2018, the American Library Association renamed the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal, the Children's Literature Award that had borne her name since it was established as a recurring honour in 1960, to the Children's Literature Legacy Award, citing concerns about the racial content of the Little House books as the primary reason. The award still exists, the literature is still read. But the reckoning with what the books include and what they erase is now formally part of the public record in a way that the 1930s publishing market never required and never wanted. 3 books in 4 years. Wisconsin, New York, Kansas, each one different in geography and texture. Each one carrying Laura's essential material, the sensory memory of a childhood lived close to the ground, the smell of rain on tall grass and wood smoke and animal-warm barns, but shaped by an editorial relationship that was growing more practiced, more confident, and more complicated with every manuscript that passed between 2 women who loved each other and disagreed about nearly everything. What no one looking in from the outside could easily see was the sheer physical labour of what Laura was doing. She was in her mid to late 60s. The farm still required tending. Almanzo's health remained limited. She was producing 2 full handwritten drafts of each book before anyone typed a single word, meaning that every novel represented hundreds of pages of pencil work, sitting at a table, pressing hard enough to make the letters clear, or hour after hour in the kind of sustained effort that tires hands far younger than hers. She never complained about this in any letter that has survived. She noted it factually in occasional passing references to the physical work of writing. And then she turned back to the yellow tablets and kept going. There was more story left, more geography to cover. The family had not yet made it to Minnesota, or Iowa, or back to Dakota Territory, where the hardest years had waited for them like a debt coming due. And somewhere in New York, Harper's editors were reading the mounting stack of fan mail and calculating what the series might look like if it ran another 4 books beyond the current 3. The audience was not just holding, it was growing. The woman in the Missouri farmhouse had 3 successful books under her belt and was, by most professional definitions, no longer a debut author. She was a working writer with a series, a publisher, and a readership. The question was whether she could sustain it, whether the memories still had enough fuel, and whether the collaboration between mother and daughter could hold under the weight of increasingly difficult material. Because the next books would not be about Wisconsin winters and maple sugaring and the comfortable warmth of a log house. They would be about blindness, about near starvation, about a whole town of people fighting to stay alive through a winter that would not end. And Laura would have to write all of it from memory, and from the particular kind of honesty that comes not from distance, but from having lived so close to those events that they had never fully left her. By 1937, the notebooks were getting harder to open, not physically. Laura's hands were still steady enough to grip a pencil, still patient enough to fill page after page in that careful script she'd been using for 7 years now. The tablets were the same cheap-lined paper from the general store. The bedroom where she worked hadn't changed. What had changed was the territory she was walking back into. The first 3 books, Wisconsin Woods, Almanzo's prosperous New York childhood, the Kansas Prairie, had been distant enough, soft enough around the edges, that writing them felt almost like visiting a place that couldn't hurt her anymore. Warm memories wrapped in the safety of 6 decades of distance. But the 4th book was asking her to go somewhere she had spent most of her adult life trying not to think about too carefully. Minnesota. The dugout. The year her sister Mary went blind. On the Banks of Plum Creek, published in 1937, opens with the Ingalls family arriving in Minnesota to find a house that is barely a house at all, a dugout carved into a creek bank, dark and low-ceilinged, more cave than home. Laura was now 70 years old, sitting in a proper farmhouse in Missouri, with glass windows and a real roof and 200 acres of orchard and pasture around her. And she was writing her way back into a dirt hole in the ground where her family had lived like animals burrowing into the earth because they had nowhere else to go. She wrote the grasshopper plague, the way the insects came in clouds so thick they blocked the sun, the way they ate everything, crops, clothes, the very wooden handles of farm tools, the sound of millions of insects chewing, the smell, the absolute demolition of a year's work in an afternoon, and the slow, sickening realization that there would be no harvest, no money, no way forward except to borrow and try again. And then she wrote Mary. Her sister Mary had been 15 years old in 1879 when an illness struck that the family called brain fever, a term that covered a multitude of fevers they didn't have better language for. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms suggests it was likely viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and its surrounding membranes. The illness came with high fever, terrible headaches, and then, slowly and irreversibly, the destruction of Mary's optic nerves. By the time the fever broke, Mary could not see. She would never see again. 15 years old, in a dugout in Minnesota, on the edge of a family already so financially fragile that one more disaster might break them entirely. And this disaster was permanent. Laura had been 12 when it happened, old enough to understand what blindness meant, old enough to see her parents' faces, old enough to know, in the way children know things they are never directly told, that Mary's future had just collapsed into something much smaller and harder than anyone had imagined for her. Now, 58 years later, Laura had to write it down for children who would read it at breakfast tables in homes with electric lights and steady incomes. She did not shy away. The book makes clear that Mary's blindness was a catastrophe, that it changed everything, that it was not a gentle lesson or a story with an easy moral. It was loss, permanent, irreversible loss. And the family had to keep moving forward anyway because there was no other option. Harper & Brothers published On the Banks of Plum Creek in 1937. In 1938, it received a Newbery Honour. Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 71, had just won the first major literary award of her career. The American Library Association, the professional organisation that represented every children's librarian in the country, had looked at her work and said, "This matters." It was the beginning of something unprecedented. Over the next 7 years, 4 more Little House books were published, and every single one of them earned a Newbery Honour by the Shores of Silver Lake, 1939. The families moved to Dakota Territory, where Pa took a job with the railroad and they lived in a surveyor's house on the empty prairie. Mary, now blind, learning to navigate a world she could no longer see. Newbery Honour, 1940. The Long Winter, 1940. The brutal winter of 1880 to 1881, when a relentless series of blizzard storms, not one continuous blizzard, but storm after storm after storm from October through May, cut the little town of De Smet off from all supplies and nearly starved the entire population. Newbery Honour, 1941. Little Town on the Prairie, 1941. Laura as a teenager, earning her teaching certificate, starting to work, beginning to notice a young farmer named Almanzo Wilder, who kept showing up with his fast horses and his quiet, steady attention. Newbery Honour, 1942. These Happy Golden Years, 1943. Laura's teaching terms, Almanzo's courtship, and finally, at 18, her marriage, the place where the series ends, not because her life ended, but because the story she had decided to tell reached its natural close. Newbery Honour, 1944, 5 Newbery Honours in 7 years. More than any other author had received in the award's first 2 decades, and yet she never won the medal itself, the top prize, the one that goes to a single book each year as the most distinguished contribution to American children's literature. 5 times she was the runner-up. 5 times she came close. The American Library Association's award committee kept no record of their reasoning, so any explanation for why Wilder was honoured so consistently, but never quite elevated to the top, remained speculation. Perhaps the committee preferred more experimental or innovative work. Perhaps the serialized nature of the books meant each was judged on its own, rather than as part of a cumulative achievement. Perhaps her plain, unornamented prose style felt too simple next to more elaborate medal winners. Or perhaps 5 honours, taken together, say something the medal alone never could. This woman's work was so consistently excellent, so reliably powerful, that it earned recognition year after year after year, a sustained achievement that outlasted any single triumph. Laura kept the bronze medal from each honour in a drawer at Rocky Ridge Farm. She did not talk about them much, but she kept them. In October of 1937, between the publication of Plum Creek and Silver Lake, something unusual happened. Laura agreed to speak in public. She was 70 years old. She had spent the previous 7 years as a working author, but almost entirely from the privacy of her Missouri farmhouse. No book tours, no publicity appearances. The occasional letter to a librarian or a reader, but mostly silence, just the books themselves, moving out into the world while she stayed home. But in October 1937, she travelled to Detroit for a book fair held at a department store, and she stood in front of an audience and talked about her life and her books. The speech was later transcribed and published in scholarly collections, and it remains the clearest window we have into how Laura understood her own work. Her central claim, repeated more than once, was simple and absolute. All I have told is true, not based on true events, not inspired by my childhood, true, as in, this happened, as in, I am not making this up. It was, of course, not entirely accurate. The books were fictionalized. Timelines had been adjusted, characters combined, whole difficult years omitted entirely. She had transformed first-person autobiography into third-person narrative, turned I into Laura, and shaped raw memory into story. But what she meant, what she was defending, was the emotional truth underneath the editorial choices. The hunger had been real. The cold had been real. Mary's blindness, the grasshoppers, the fear, the long winters, Pa's restlessness, Ma's exhaustion, all of it had happened, even if the exact sequence and phrasing had been refined for a children's audience. She was 70 years old, standing in a Detroit department store, insisting to a room full of strangers that her childhood had not been invented, that it mattered, that it was worth remembering exactly as it had felt at the time. It was the only major public speech she ever gave about the books. After Detroit, she went home to Missouri, picked up a pencil, and went back to work. If there was a book in the series that tested Laura more than any other, it was The Long Winter. Published in 1940, it covers the winter of 1880 to 1881 in the newly settled town of De Smet, Dakota Territory. The historical record is clear. It was one of the worst winters in the region's documented history. Not a single continuous 7-month blizzard, as it's sometimes misremembered, but a relentless succession of severe storms, one after another, from October through May, that buried the town under snow and cut off all rail service for months. No trains meant no supplies. No supplies meant no food beyond what families had stored in the fall. And most families, new to the territory and not expecting such a savage season, had not stored nearly enough. The book describes weeks of grinding cold, dwindling food stores, and the slow realization that the whole town might starve before spring. Laura writes about grinding seed wheat in a coffee mill to make bread because there was no other grain left, about burning twisted hay for warmth because the coal was gone, about days so cold and dark that it felt as if the sun might never return. And she writes about Almanzo Wilder and another young man risking their lives to drive out across the open prairie in the middle of winter to find a farmer rumoured to have wheat stored, bringing it back to the town just before people began to die. It is the moment in the series where Almanzo steps forward as more than a background character. It is also the moment where Laura, writing at 73, had to go back into the cold and hunger of a winter she had survived 60 years earlier and find the words to make it real again without making it unbearable for children. The book is relentless. It does not soften the fear. But it also does what Laura always did best. It shows a family and a community holding together under impossible pressure, finding ways to survive not because they were special or chosen, but because they refused to give up. The Long Winter received a Newbery Honour in 1941. Librarians and reviewers praised its unflinching honesty and its restraint. It became one of the most taught books in the series, used in classrooms across the country as an example of how to write about hardship without descending into either sentimentality or despair. Laura never said in any letter that survives how it felt to write that book, but you can feel the weight of it in the pages. This was not a nostalgic memory. This was a scar she had carried her whole life, and she opened it carefully, on purpose, because the story demanded it. The last 3 Little House books were published during World War II. The Long Winter came out in 1940, a year into the European War before the United States had entered the conflict. Little Town on the Prairie in 1941, the year of Pearl Harbor, these happy golden years in 1943, in the middle of the war's darkest years. The timing was not planned. Laura had been working steadily through the series since 1932, and by the early 1940s she was simply reaching the end of the story she had set out to tell, but the context shaped how the books were received. Americans in 1940, 1941, 1942. 1943 were living through a global catastrophe, rationing, blackouts, casualty lists, fear that reached into every household, and in the middle of that, here were these quiet books about a family on the frontier 70 years earlier, holding together through blizzards and hunger and isolation. The themes Laura had been writing about since 1932, self-reliance, community cooperation, making do with less, enduring hardship without losing hope, resonated in a new and urgent way during wartime. Readers who might have once dismissed the books as old-fashioned nostalgia now found something they needed in them, proof that people could survive impossible circumstances if they stayed together and kept moving forward. Publishers faced paper rationing during the war, and many books went out of print or saw their print runs slashed. The Little House series kept selling, libraries kept ordering copies, teachers kept assigning them. Laura was writing from the past, but she was speaking to the present in ways she could never have anticipated when she first sharpened those pencils in 1930. These Happy Golden Years was published when Laura was 76 years old. The book ends with Laura's marriage to Almanzo, which makes narrative sense. It's a natural stopping point, the place where childhood transitions into adulthood, where one story ends and another begins. Readers understood it as a conclusion. Harper understood it as a conclusion. But Laura had actually written one more manuscript. It was called The First 4 Years, and it covered the early years of her marriage, the diphtheria that disabled Almanzo, the death of their infant son, the house fire, the crop failures, the grinding poverty, and the slow collapse of every hope they'd carried into their marriage. She did not submit it for publication. We don't know exactly why. The manuscript was found among her papers after her death, and eventually published in 1971, 14 years after she died. But during her lifetime, she finished writing it and then set it aside. Maybe it was too dark. Maybe, after 8 books that had ended on warmth and hope and forward motion, she didn't want to end the series on devastation. Maybe she was simply too tired. 76 years old, still working a farm, still navigating the complicated relationship with Rose that had fueled and strained every book. Maybe she and Rose disagreed about whether to publish it, and Laura chose silence over conflict. Or maybe she just knew. In the way writers sometimes know, that the story she wanted to tell was complete, that the series had done what it needed to do, that there was power in stopping at the marriage, at the moment of possibility, before life came in with its inevitable fractures. In 1943, Laura Ingalls Wilder put down her pencil for the last time as a published author of the Little House books. She had written 8 books in 11 years. She had earned 5 Newbery Honours. She had created one of the most enduring children's series in American literary history. She had done it while in her 60s and 70s, in a farmhouse in Missouri, with tools a schoolchild could afford. And she had done it by walking, again and again, back into a past that was not always kind to her, and finding the language to make other people see it, feel it. and carry it forward. That was where the book stopped. But the story of what those books became, of the awards, the legacy, the controversies, and the woman who lived another 14 years after writing her last word, that story still had ground to cover. When these happy golden years reached bookstores in 1943, something unusual happened in the publishing world. A 76-year-old woman stopped writing. Not because her publisher asked her to stop. Harper would have gladly published another 10 Laura Ingalls Wilder books if she'd written them. Not because readers stopped caring. Letters still arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm by the dozens, asking what happened next, asking for more stories, asking if there would ever be another book about Laura and Almanzo and the Prairie. She stopped because the story she had set out to tell was finished. The series ended with an 18-year-old girl marrying a young farmer, standing on the threshold of a new life, with the whole uncertain future ahead of her. It ended at the exact moment before life would teach her what it actually costs to build something, before diphtheria and infant death and crop failures and all the grinding reality that doesn't fit inside a children's book about love and faith and family. Laura knew exactly where the line was, and she stopped there on purpose. From 1943 to 1957, Laura Ingalls Wilder lived as a woman whose creative work was behind her. She was not idle. A farm does not permit idleness, even when you're in your late 70s and your husband is in his 80s. There were still chickens to tend, still eggs to collect and sell, still the routines of a household that had been running for nearly 50 years on the same Missouri hillside. But there was no new manuscript forming in her mind, no yellow tablets filling up with penciled pages, no trips to the post office with a thick envelope addressed to Rose or to Harper Brothers offices in New York. The rhythm that had defined her 60s and 70s, the slow, methodical transformation of memory into story, the endless revisions, the negotiations with Rose over what to keep and what to cut, was over. What replaced it was something quieter. Letters from readers, occasional visits from people who wanted to meet the woman who had written the Little House books. The daily work of keeping a farm running even as both she and Almanzo were slowing into the kind of old age that makes every physical task take twice as long as it used to. And underneath all of that, the awareness that the books were out there, living their own lives now, being read by children she would never meet in towns whose names she would never know. They were doing what she had hoped they would do. They were lasting. Almanzo died on an autumn day at Rocky Ridge. He was 92 years old. He had lived with the limp and the cane for 61 years, had outlived the doctors who told him in 1888 that his body might recover, had built a 200-acre farm from 40 rocky acres despite a nervous system that never fully repaired itself. Laura was 82. They had been married for 64 years, longer than most people live at all. Long enough that there was almost no memory in her adult life that did not have Almanzo somewhere in it, standing beside her, or working in the barn, or sitting across the kitchen table in the evenings when the day's work was done. The house felt wrong without him. Not in the dramatic way grief announces itself in the first days after a death, but in the slow, accumulating wrongness of a space where someone is supposed to be and isn't. His coat still hung by the door. His tools were still in the barn, arranged the way he had left them. The fields he had worked for more than half a century were still there, still growing, still producing, as if a farm cares whether the man who built it is alive to see the harvest. Laura did not write about this either. No diary entries have been found from the years after Almanzo's death. No letters that describe what it felt like to be an 82-year-old widow living alone in a farmhouse she and her husband had built together, room by room, over decades. But she stayed. Rocky Ridge was hers. The deed had been in her name since 1894, and the farm had been the one constant in a life that had seen too much motion, too many failed attempts at rootedness in places that could not hold her family. This place had held. She was not leaving. In 1953, Harper and Brothers made a decision that would reshape how millions of readers would see the Little House books for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. They commissioned a new illustrated edition with uniform artwork across all 8 books, created by an illustrator named Garth Williams. Williams was not an unknown. He had illustrated E.B. White's Stuart Little in 1945 and Charlotte's Web in 1952, two of the most beloved children's books in America. His style was warm, detailed and naturalistic in a way that felt both timeless and accessible. Harper knew he was the right choice. But Williams didn't just sit in a New York studio and sketch frontier scenes from imagination. He did something almost no illustrator had ever done for a children's book series. He travelled. He went to Wisconsin, to the site of the big woods where the Ingalls family had lived when Laura was a small child. He went to Kansas, to the land where the little house on the prairie had stood. He went to Minnesota, to the banks of Plum Creek. He went to South Dakota, to the shores of Silver Lake and the town of De Smet, where Laura had spent her teenage years and met Almanzo. He photographed landscapes. He sketched buildings and animals and the specific light that falls across a Dakota prairie at dawn. He studied the historical record, the clothing and tools and wagons and stoves that would have been accurate to the 1870s and 1880s. He did the research that a good illustrator does when they want the work to be something more than decoration. They want it to be true. And then he drew. Simple pencil, charcoal and ink illustrations. Not flashy, not overly detailed. Just clear, warm, precise images that showed a girl in a calico dress standing in a doorway, a man playing a fiddle by firelight, a family in a covered wagon moving across an empty land. The 1953 Garth Williams edition became the definitive visual interpretation of the Little House books. The edition's still in print today. The images that children see when they open the books for the first time, Laura saw them. She was 86 years old when the new edition was released, and she held in her hands a version of her own childhood that had been reimagined by an artist who had never met her as a child, who had walked the same land 60 years later and tried to see it the way she had seen it. There is no record of what she said about the illustrations, but they became part of the books, part of the legacy, part of the way the Little House series would be remembered long after she was gone. In June of 1954, the Association for Library Service to Children, the professional organisation of children's librarians across the United States, did something they had never done before. They created a special one-time award, and they gave it to Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was 87 years old. The award recognised her substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children. It came with a bronze medal. This was not the recurring Laura Ingalls Wilder Award that would later become one of the most prestigious honours in children's literature. That ongoing award would be established separately, first given in 1960 to author Clara Ingram Judson. The 1954 presentation was something different, a singular honour for a singular career, given to the woman herself while she was still alive to receive it. Think about what that means for a moment. Laura was not receiving an award named after someone else. She was receiving an award that existed only for her, created specifically to mark what she had accomplished. And then, after she was gone, the Library Association would take her name and attach it to an honour that would be given to other writers, year after year, as a way of saying, this is the standard. This is what we mean when we talk about books that last. She had done what almost no writer does. She had lived long enough to see her own name become a measure of excellence. The ceremony was quiet as far as public ceremonies go. Laura was not a woman who sought attention, and by 87 she was well past the age where travel for awards felt like anything other than exhausting. But the medal came to her, one way or another, and she kept it. The way she had kept the 5 Newbery Honour medals from the 1940s, in a drawer, not displayed, not spoken about much, but kept. Proof that the books had done what she intended. Proof that the story had lasted. There was one more book. Laura had written it in the early 1940s, during the final years of the series, but she had never sent it to Harper for publication. The manuscript sat in a drawer at Rocky Ridge Farm, complete but silent, for the rest of her life. It was called The First 4 Years. The book covered the early years of her marriage to Almanzo, the years between the wedding that ends, these happy golden years, and the move to Missouri that she had always refused to write about in detail. It described the diphtheria that left Almanzo disabled, the death of their infant son, the house fire, the crop failures, the slow unravelling of every hope they had carried into their marriage. It was, in other words, the book that could not exist within the framework of the Little House mythology. It was too dark, too honest about failure, too willing to admit that hard work and love and faith are sometimes not enough, that the land does not always give back what you put into it, that a young couple can do everything right and still lose almost everything. Laura finished it, and then she set it aside. We don't know exactly why. The letters that might explain her decision have not been found, or were never written in the first place. Maybe she and Rose disagreed about whether it should be published, and Laura chose peace over argument. Maybe Laura simply knew that readers didn't need this book, that the 8 published volumes were the complete story as far as the public was concerned, and this 9th manuscript was something else, something private, a reckoning she needed to write but did not need to share. Or maybe she just understood endings, and she knew that these happy golden years, with its warmth and its hope, and its 18-year-old bride standing on the threshold of a marriage, was the right place to stop, before the threshold turned into a floor that gave way beneath her. The manuscript stayed in the drawer until after her death. It was published in 1971, 14 years after she died, and Garth Williams illustrated it to match the rest of the series. But in Laura's lifetime, it remained unspoken. One more silence among all the others. Laura turned 90 years old on February 7th, 1957. She had been born in a log cabin in Wisconsin in 1867, in the middle of a war-torn century, to parents who would spend the next 20 years moving her from state to state in search of a stability they never quite found. She had taught school at 15, married at 18, survived disasters that should have broken her and didn't, raised a daughter who became more famous than she was for a while, worked as a farm journalist for 2 decades, and then, at 63, picked up a pencil and started writing the books that would make her one of the most widely read authors in American history. 90 years is a long time to carry a life. Long enough to bury almost everyone you started with. Her parents were gone. Her sisters Mary, Carrie, and Grace were gone. Almanzo was gone. Yeah, most of the people who had known her as a young woman on the Dakota Prairie were gone. The books were still here, selling steadily, being read in schools and libraries across the country. Garth Williams' new illustrations had just brought them to a new generation of readers. Her name was on an award that would honour other writers long after she was gone. She had outlasted almost everything except the work. 3 days later, on February 10th, 1957, she died at Rocky Ridge Farm. Quietly. At home. In the house that she and Almanzo had built from Missouri timber, and 40 years of stubborn refusal to give up. She was 90 years and 3 days old. They buried her next to Almanzo in the Mansfield Cemetery, not far from the farm. The grave is simple. The stone carries her name, her dates, and nothing else. No quote from the books. No summary of achievements, just the facts. Laura Ingalls Wilder, 1867 to 1957. It is enough. The books are the monument. The 8 published volumes and the 9th that would follow later, and the illustrated editions that Garth Williams had drawn, and the award that carried her name forward into the hands of other writers, and the millions of readers who would pick up Little House in the Big Woods for the first time, years and decades after her death, and find in it something they needed. She knew this would happen. She had built it on purpose, and then she had let it go. The way you let go of anything you make that is meant to outlive you. Rocky Ridge Farm is still there, preserved as a museum, open to visitors who come from across the country to see the room where she wrote, the desk where the tablets and pencils sat, the fields that Almanzo worked, the spring in the ravine that ran cold and clear the day they arrived in 1894 and still runs today. The house holds her life in a way the books never could. The books hold the myth. The house holds the woman. Both are true, both are necessary, and both are hers. You're looking at 2 women in the same farmhouse, working on the same book, and if you asked either one of them to explain exactly where one person's work ended and the other's began, neither could give you a clean answer. This was the arrangement that built the Little House books. Not a simple arrangement, not an easy one. And for most of the 13 years between 1930 and 1943, not one that either woman talked about honestly in public. Laura wrote the books. That much appeared on every title page, every library card, every review. By Laura Ingalls Wilder, sole author. But inside the farmhouse, on the sleeping porch where Rose kept her typewriter, in the letters that travelled back and forth when Rose was living elsewhere, in the manuscripts themselves with their layers of revision, there was another story, a collaboration so deep and so tangled that untangling it now, decades later, feels like trying to separate two colours of thread that were twisted together while still wet. The truth is this: Laura could not have published these books without Rose, and Rose could not have created them without Laura. Everything else is argument. Here is how it worked, book after book, for 11 years. Laura sat in her upstairs bedroom at Rocky Ridge and wrote by hand. Always in pencil, she never typed, never learned, never wanted to. She used cheap yellow-lined tablets, the kind schoolchildren carried. She wrote in a small, careful script, filling page after page with the memories she was pulling out of the air and pinning down in graphite. She typically wrote 2 full drafts by hand before she considered a manuscript ready to leave her room. 2 passes through the entire story, revising as she went, tightening scenes, adjusting dialogue, making sure the details were as accurate as she could make them. Then she gave the handwritten pages to Rose. Rose typed them. That sounds simple. It was not. When Rose sat down at her typewriter with Laura's penciled tablets in front of her, she was not just transferring words from one medium to another. She was editing, heavily, structurally, in ways that went far beyond fixing grammar or trimming a sentence. The evidence for this comes from the manuscripts that have survived and the letters between mother and daughter that document their process. Scholars who have compared Laura's handwritten drafts to Rose's typed versions find entire sections reorganised for better pacing, dialogue tightened and made more naturalistic, descriptions expanded with sensory detail, chapter breaks moved or added, scenes cut entirely when they slowed momentum, perspective shifts to make the child, Laura's voice, more consistent. Rose did not ask permission for most of these changes. She made them, typed them into the manuscript, and then sent the typescript back to Laura for review. Laura would read Rose's version. Sometimes she accepted the changes without comment. Sometimes she pushed back, arguing that a scene needed to stay. That a detail Rose had cut was important, that the way Rose had rewritten a passage didn't sound like how it had actually happened. They would negotiate, through letters, if Rose was living away from Missouri, face to face if she was at Rocky Ridge. Laura had veto power. It was her book, her name, her contract. But she rarely used it, because she trusted Rose's professional instincts and knew that Rose understood the publishing market in ways she never would. After Laura approved Rose's typescript, with or without further changes, the manuscript went to Harper & Brothers in New York, where yet another layer of editing happened. Harper's editors made their own adjustments, and those pages came back to Laura for final approval. By the time A Little House book reached a printer, it had passed through at least 4 distinct stages of revision. 1. Laura's first pencil draft 2, Laura's second pencil draft 3, Rose's typed and edited version 4, Harper's editorial version. And in every state except the first, someone other than Laura Ingalls Wilder had made decisions about what the book would say and how it would say it. This was not ghostwriting. Ghostwriting is when one person writes while another person takes credit. Laura wrote the original material from her own memories. The stories, the events, the family dynamics, the sensory details of life in a log cabin or a dugout or a claim shanty. All of that came from her, and no one else could have provided it. But it was also not solo authorship in the way that phrase is usually understood. It was collaboration, deep, sustained, sometimes uncomfortable collaboration between a mother who had lived the stories and a daughter who knew how to shape them for a market. Rose Wilder Lane never appeared on a title page of A Little House book. Her name does not show up in the acknowledgements. Laura's public statements about the books almost never mentioned Rose's role beyond vague references to help or typing. This was a deliberate choice, and it served everyone's interests. Laura's interest, She wanted to be the author, not co-author, not as told to. She had spent 63 years being Charles Ingalls' daughter, Almanzo Wilder's wife, Rose Lane's mother, Mrs. A.J. Wilder, the farm columnist. The Little House books were the first thing in her entire life that was hers alone in the eyes of the public. Sharing that credit would have diminished something she had waited her whole life to claim. Rose's interest. She was already a published author and journalist with her own career and her own reputation. Being known as her mother's co-author or editor would have locked her into a supporting role in someone else's story. She had her own novels to write, her own political essays, her own literary ambitions, and she may have understood that publicly claiming credit for her mother's books would raise uncomfortable questions about how much of Laura Ingalls Wilder was actually Rose Wilder Lane. Harper's interest, single authorship was cleaner to market. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's autobiographical memories sold better than Laura Ingalls Wilder with editorial assistance from Rose Wilder Lane. The whole appeal of the books was that they felt like an elderly woman sharing her real childhood in her own voice. Acknowledging a professional editor in the mix would have broken the spell. So all three parties, Laura, Rose and Harper, agreed, without ever saying so explicitly, that Rose's role would remain invisible. In private, it was a different story. Rose's letters to friends make clear that she considered herself essential to the book's success. She referred to the editorial work as exhausting, time-consuming, and sometimes frustrating when Laura resisted changes Rose believed were necessary. She saw herself as the professional writer rescuing her amateur mother's raw material and making it publishable. Laura's letters show she was sometimes resentful of Rose's heavy hand, protective of her memories, and uncomfortable with changes that made the books feel less true to what had actually happened. But she also acknowledged privately that she could not navigate the publishing world without Rose's expertise. It was a partnership built on mutual need and mutual silence, and it lasted, under that strain, for 11 years and 8 books. Most of the arguments between Laura and Rose happened in private, and most of them left no written record. But a few survive in letters, and they tell us something important about the friction underneath the collaboration. When Laura was writing Little House on the Prairie, Tadakente, the third book in the series, she and Rose clashed over how to portray Native Americans. The book is set in Kansas in the early 1870s, on land that was part of the Osage Diminished Reserve, territory that the US government had promised to the Osage Nation and where white settlement was illegal. Laura's family was there unlawfully, though as a small child Laura would not have understood that. In her draft, Laura included her mother's fear and prejudice toward Native people, Ma's statements about Indians being dangerous, her relief when they left the area. Laura also included moments that suggested more complexity. Pa's respect for native people he encountered, a detailed scene of Osage men visiting the cabin and Laura watching them with a child's fascinated curiosity rather than fear. Rose wanted to cut or soften some of the more overtly racist language, not apparently out of a sense of justice toward native people, but because she worried it would make Ma unsympathetic to readers and hurt book sales. Laura pushed back. She argued that this was how Ma had actually felt, that removing it would be dishonest, and that showing the range of white settler attitudes, Ma's fear, Pa's respect, Laura's curiosity, was more truthful than sanitizing it. The version that was published contains both, Ma's prejudiced statements and Pa's more nuanced interactions. It is not a comfortable book to read now, and it shouldn't be. The family was part of a settler colonial project that dispossessed native peoples, and the book's portrayal of that reality is shaped by both 1870s white settler attitudes and 1930s editorial choices that valued narrative tension over historical reckoning. The fact that Laura and Rose argued about it tells us that both women were aware the portrayal mattered. Neither chose to address it head-on in a way that would have centered native perspectives or acknowledged the illegality of the Ingalls presence. That failure is part of the book's legacy. Another point of likely disagreement, though the evidence here is more speculative, concerns the first 4 years, the manuscript Laura wrote about her early marriage, and then never submitted for publication. The book is bleak. It covers diphtheria, infant death, house fire, crop failure, and Almanzo's permanent disability, all in the span of a few years. There is no warmth, no forward momentum, no sense that hard work will be rewarded, just disaster after disaster and a young couple barely holding on. It does not fit the Little House mythology. It does not end with hope, and it was never published in Laura's lifetime, which means either she chose not to submit it, or Rose advised against it and Laura agreed, or they fought about it, and Laura chose silence over conflict. We don't know which. The manuscript sat in a drawer until after Laura's death, and neither woman left a clear explanation for why, but the fact that Laura wrote it, that she spent time and effort drafting a book she knew didn't fit the series, suggests she may have needed to write it for herself, regardless of whether it ever reached readers. That she finished it and then set it aside tells us something about the limits of what the collaboration could hold. In 1993, a biographer named William Holtz published The Ghost in the Little House, a biography of Rose Wilder Lane that argued Rose's contributions to the Little House books were so extensive she should be considered a co-author. The book set off a firestorm in Wilder scholarship. Fans who had grown up believing Laura wrote the books herself felt betrayed. Scholars who had long suspected Rose's role was larger than publicly acknowledged felt vindicated. The debate has continued ever since, and it will likely never be fully resolved because the question itself is flawed. Asking who really wrote the Little House books assumes a single answer is possible. It isn't. What we know from manuscript evidence. Laura wrote the original content in her own handwriting, from her own memories, in her own words. Rose extensively revised structure, pacing, dialogue, and descriptive passages. Some sections show evidence of Rose writing entirely new material to smooth transitions or fill gaps. Other sections show Laura's original phrasing surviving almost unchanged through to publication. The degree of Rose's intervention varied from book to book and scene to scene. The current scholarly consensus is that this was a genuine collaboration, not equal in all respects, but genuine. Laura provided the irreplaceable foundation, the lived experience, the memory, the emotional truth. Rose provided the irreplaceable craft, the professional editorial skill, the understanding of market and structure, the ability to shape raw autobiography into literature that could reach a mass audience. Both contributions mattered. Both women were essential, and the fact that only one name appeared on the books is a reflection of 1930s publishing conventions, gender dynamics, and the commercial appeal of a single author, true story, not an accurate representation of how the books were actually made. For decades, this collaboration was invisible. Readers assumed Laura had written the books alone. Laura let them assume it. Rose stayed silent. Harper marketed the books as pure autobiography. In the 1990s and 2000s, as scholars began examining the manuscripts and letters more closely, the truth started to surface. Some readers felt deceived. Others felt it explained things they had always sensed, a level of craft and polish that seemed unusual for an amateur writer with an 8th grade education. But acknowledging the collaboration doesn't diminish Laura. If anything, it makes her achievement more human and more interesting. She was not a lone genius producing perfect books in isolation. She was a woman with a story to tell who found a way to tell it by accepting help from someone whose skills complemented her own. That is not failure. That is wisdom. And acknowledging Rose's contribution doesn't make her a villain or a fraud. She used her professional skills to help her mother achieve something Laura could not have achieved alone. That is not theft. That is the work of editing, which is a creative act in its own right. What matters now is telling the truth about how these books came to be. Not to assign blame or distribute credit in some perfectly balanced way, but to understand that great literature often emerges from partnerships. Messy, complicated, sometimes uncomfortable partnerships between people who need each other and sometimes resent each other and keep working together anyway because the work matters more than the discomfort. Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane spent 13 years in that partnership, from the first Pioneer Girl typescript in 1930 to the final revisions of these happy golden years in 1943. They made 8 books together. They argued, they compromised, They kept each other's secrets, and they created something that outlasted both of them. That is the real story. Not who wrote the books, but how two women, across a generation gap and a gulf of experience, built something neither could have built alone. And now you know. Every story is built as much from what you leave out as from what you put in. Laura knew this. She had learned it across 2 decades of farm journalism, where every column had a word count and every unnecessary sentence was a sentence the reader might not finish. She had learned it through 8 books and countless revisions with Rose, where the question was never just, is this true? But does this belong in this story? And she had learned it, most importantly, from living a life that contained more hardship and failure than any children's book could hold, without collapsing under the weight. So she made choices. Deliberate, careful choices about what would appear on the page and what would stay silent in her memory. And some of those choices were editorial, refinements for pacing, adjustments for a young audience. Others were deeper, strategic omissions that shaped not just the books, but the entire mythology of pioneer life they would come to represent. Tonight, you're walking into the spaces she left empty. The year that vanished from the timeline. The poverty that got softened into making do. The settlers' failures that got rewritten as rugged persistence. The whole architecture of silence that turned a struggling family's chaotic frontier experience into America's most beloved vision of pioneer resilience. Because here's what Laura understood, even if she never said it out loud. The story people wanted wasn't the story she had actually lived. If you line up the 8 published Little House books in chronological order, you get a clear path from Wisconsin to Dakota Territory, cabin in the big woods, little house in Kansas, dugout in Minnesota. Then, after a brief detour to New York for Farmer Boy, the family appears on the shores of Silver Lake in Dakota Territory, where Pa has taken a railroad job and they're moving into the surveyor's house. Clean, sequential, easy to follow, except there's a gap. Between Minnesota and Dakota Territory, there's a year, actually closer to 2 years, that Laura lived through and then erased so completely from the published books that most readers never knew it existed. The Ingalls family didn't go straight from Minnesota to Dakota. They went backward, east, not west, away from the frontier, not toward it. And they went because they were broke, desperate and out of options. Pa's friend offered him a job managing a hotel in Burr Oak, a small town in northeast Iowa, not farming, not homesteading, not building a claim or proving up land, just wage labour, running someone else's business, living in rooms above someone else's property, serving meals to travellers who could afford to pay for them. Laura was 9 years old when they arrived, old enough to understand what it meant that they were living in a hotel instead of their own house, old enough to see the look on her mother's face when Pa took this job instead of another attempt at a homestead, old enough to work. She and Mary helped in the hotel dining room. They set tables, cleared dishes, washed plates in the kitchen. Child labour, though no one called it that then. It was just what children did when their family needed the money. It was not romantic. It was not the sunlit prairie or the cosy log cabin or the little house with Pa's fiddle singing in the firelight. It was a commercial establishment in a settled town, doing repetitive work for someone else's profit, with no land and no claim, and no story to tell that fit the myth of westward pioneers carving civilization out of wilderness. Laura wrote about Burr Oak in Pioneer Girl, the original autobiography she drafted in 1930. It's right there in the manuscript, sandwiched between Minnesota and Dakota. The hotel, the work, the year they spent not pioneering at all but surviving on wages in a place they didn't want to be. And then, when Pioneer Girl was rejected and reshaped into the children's series, Burr Oak disappeared. Not by accident, not because Laura forgot. She made a choice, either on her own or in consultation with Rose, that this year didn't belong in the story she was building. Why? Because Burr Oak was failure, not frontier adventure, not family resilience in the face of natural disaster, just plain economic failure. The kind where a man gives up on his dream of owning land and takes a job working for someone else, in a town that represented everything the Ingalls family had been trying to escape by moving west in the first place. Burr Oak didn't fit the narrative arc. It broke the forward momentum. It turned Pa from a restless pioneer into a man who sometimes ran out of options. And it made the family look less like brave settlers and more like what they actually were, a working-class family bouncing from one failed attempt to another, taking whatever work they could find to keep food on the table. So Laura cut it. Cleanly. Completely. The published books jump from Minnesota to Dakota Territory with only a vague reference to some time passing, and millions of readers never knew there had been a year in Iowa where the Ingalls family lived above a hotel and Laura cleared plates from strangers' tables. That silence is choice, and it tells you everything about what kind of story Laura was writing and what kind she was not. If you read the Little House books as a child, you came away with an impression of hardship, yes, but hardship that was manageable. The family was poor, but they made do. Pa hunted. Ma stretched every scrap of food. They wore patched dresses and had no store-bought toys, but there was always enough. Enough food, enough warmth. Enough security that you never really feared they might not survive. That impression is a lie of omission. The Ingalls family was not gently poor. They were often on the edge of genuine destitution, one bad harvest or one illness away from collapse. The books soften this, again and again, in ways so subtle you don't notice unless you're looking for them. Take the Kansas book. In Little House on the Prairie, the family builds a house, plants a garden, and then leaves because the government is about to force white settlers off Osage land. It's presented as a sudden external disruption, bad luck, bad timing, forces beyond their control. What the book doesn't emphasize, they were there illegally in the first place. They built a house and tried to establish a claim on land that belonged to the Osage Nation under treaty. And when they left, they lost everything they had invested. That's not just bad luck. That's a failed gamble, and one that Charles Ingalls made knowing the risks. Or take Minnesota. On the banks of Plum Creek describes the grasshopper plague that destroyed the crops, the year with no harvest, the fear and uncertainty. But it ends on a note of recovery. The family survives. Spring comes. Things get better. What the book minimizes, that grasshopper plague was one in a series of financial disasters that left the family so deeply in debt they could barely function. They didn't just get through it. They scraped by on borrowed money, on odd jobs, on Charles doing manual labour in town while Carolyn took in sewing, on Laura working at age 9 because the family needed whatever penny she could earn. And even that undersells it, because the books never talk about what debt actually meant on the frontier. It meant you were trapped. Creditors could take your property, your tools, your livestock. It meant every purchase was a negotiation, every bill a source of anxiety. It meant your children went without necessities not because resources didn't exist, but because you couldn't afford them. Laura knew this. She lived it. She watched her mother's face when there wasn't enough flour for another week. She felt the knot in her stomach when Pa came home and said the crop had failed again. She wore dresses so patched and faded that going to school meant walking in wearing visible poverty. But she wrote around it. She gave readers the emotional truth, the anxiety, the scarcity, the constant work, without the full weight of what chronic poverty actually does to a family. Because children's books in the 1930s couldn't hold that weight, and because the myth she was building required a family that struggled but prevailed, not a family that was ground down year after year by an economic system that didn't care how hard they worked. So the books show you enough hardship to feel real, but not enough to break the illusion that hard work and family love were sufficient to overcome anything. That gap between the hardship she shows and the hardship she lived is another kind of silence, another deliberate act of construction. Here's something Laura almost never talked about, not even in Pioneer Girl, and certainly not in the published books. After she and Almanzo married in 1885, after the crop failures and the diphtheria and the house fire and the death of their infant son, or after 4 years of disaster in Dakota Territory, they gave up. They admitted defeat, and in 1890 they went to live with Almanzo's parents in Spring Valley, Minnesota. For a full year, maybe longer, Laura Ingalls Wilder, the woman who would write books celebrating pioneer self-reliance, lived on her in-laws' charity. She was 23 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter and a disabled husband who could no longer do heavy farm work. They had $150 to their name. They moved into Almanzo's father's house, ate food from his farm, slept under his roof, and depended entirely on the generational wealth of a family that had succeeded where theirs had failed. James Wilder's farm was worth thousands of dollars. It was prosperous, established, built over decades of steady work and careful planning. It was the kind of farm Charles Ingalls had spent his whole life chasing and never caught. And Laura hated every minute of it. Not because the Wilders were unkind. There's no evidence they were anything but generous. But because dependency, for a woman who had spent her childhood working to keep her family afloat, who had ploughed fields herself when her husband couldn't stand, who had survived on sheer stubborn refusal to give up, dependency felt like erasure. She never wrote about it. Not in Pioneer Girl, not in the Little House books, not in letters that have survived. That year in Spring Valley exists in the historical record because town documents and church records and census data confirm it. But in Laura's own narrative of her life, it simply doesn't appear, because it contradicted everything the books were trying to say. The Little House books are about families who make it on their own, who endure hardships through grit and work and love, who don't need help because they have each other. That's the myth. That's the message readers took away and passed on to their children. Spring Valley says, sometimes you need a safety net. Sometimes you survive not because you're strong, but because you have family wealth to catch you when you fall. Sometimes the difference between making it and not making it isn't how hard you work. It's whether you have somewhere to go when the work isn't enough. Laura knew that truth. She lived it. And she buried it, because it didn't fit the story America wanted to hear in the 1930s. When the Depression was teaching millions of families that hard work alone wasn't enough and government programs were offering the safety nets that families like the Ingalls had never had. The silence about Spring Valley is strategic. It preserves the myth, and in doing so, it erases one of the most important truths about how people actually survived the frontier. They didn't do it alone. They did it with family support, with community networks, with government land grants through the Homestead Act, with borrowed money and wage labour and all the messy, unromantic infrastructure that makes survival possible when your own efforts fall short. Laura chose the myth, and in choosing it, she shaped how generations of Americans would think about self-reliance, about poverty, about what it means to make it on your own. By the time Laura sat down to write Pioneer Girl in 1930, the American frontier had been officially closed for 40 years. The 1890 census had declared there was no longer a clear line between settled and unsettled territory. The West was won, the story went. Civilization had spread from coast to coast. And almost immediately Americans started to miss it. Not the actual frontier, the hunger, the violence, the staggering failure rates, the diseases that killed children and mothers and left men disabled in their 30s. They missed the idea of the frontier, the mythology, the vision of a place where a man with nothing but determination could claim land and build a life and prove that America rewarded hard work and independence. That mythology required certain silences. It required not talking about how much of westward expansion was driven by government programs. The Homestead Act gave away land. The railroads were subsidized by federal money. The military cleared native peoples to make room for settlers. It required not talking about how many homesteaders failed, how many families went west and came back east broken. It required not talking about the violence and dispossession and settler colonialism that made white settlement possible in the first place. Laura's books became one of the most powerful vehicles for that mythology, not because she set out to deceive anyone, but because the story she was capable of telling, that she needed to tell, and that publishers wanted to buy, was a story that fit the myth better than it fit the messy reality. So, the books emphasize family togetherness in the face of hardship, hard work leading to eventual success, the beauty and possibility of open land, independence and self-reliance as core values, and the books minimize or erase the Ingalls family's repeated failures, their dependence on extended family wealth, the illegal nature of their Kansas settlement, the full extent of their poverty and debt, the year they gave up and worked wage labor in Iowa, the reality that Charles never successfully established a permanent prosperous farm. None of this makes Laura a liar. It makes her a storyteller working within the constraints of her medium, her market, her collaborator, and her own need to find meaning in a life that had contained more loss than triumph. But it does mean that the books millions of children grew up reading were not simply true stories of frontier life. They were carefully constructed narratives that selected certain truths and buried others, that highlighted resilience and hid dependency, that turned survival into virtue and erased the systems that made survival possible. The silences in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books are as important as the words, because what she chose not to say shaped what America chose to believe about itself. There's one more silence worth naming, and it's the biggest one of all. These happy golden years ends with Laura's marriage to Almanzo, 18 years old, standing at the threshold of her adult life, full of hope and possibility. It's a perfect ending for a children's series. Narrative closure. The heroine has grown up, found love, and is about to begin the next chapter. Except Laura knew what that next chapter held. She knew about the diphtheria that would leave Almanzo disabled, the infant son who would die at 27 days old, the house fire, the crop failures, the grinding poverty, the year in Spring Valley living on charity, the 40-acre Missouri farm they would buy with almost nothing and spend decades building into something stable, not through frontier adventure, but through relentless, unglamorous work. She knew all of it because she had lived all of it. And she wrote about some of it in the first 4 years, the manuscript she finished but never submitted for publication. That book is bleak. There's no other word for it. It describes a young marriage crushed under the weight of disaster after disaster, with no redemption, no triumph, no sense that things are getting better. Just two people trying to hold on while everything falls apart. Laura set that manuscript aside. She didn't fight to publish it. She didn't argue with Rose or Harper about whether it belonged in the series. She just quietly put it in a drawer and left it there. Because she understood, maybe more clearly than anyone, that the story she'd been telling for 13 years couldn't hold that book. The Little House series had built a mythology of resilience and hope and family love conquering hardship. The first 4 years said, sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes hard work doesn't save you. Sometimes you endure not because you're strong, but because you have no other choice. That truth didn't fit. So she stopped at the wedding, at the moment of hope. Before the hard years that would test everything the books had promised. It was a choice. A wise one, maybe. A necessary one, certainly, if the series was going to be what it became. But it was also an act of silence. One more piece of her life that would remain unspoken until after her death. And in that silence, Laura left room for readers to imagine that the pioneer story had a happy ending, that the girl who grew up in log cabins and dugouts and claim shanties found her way to a stable, secure, prosperous life. She did, eventually. 40 years later, on a Missouri farm built inch by inch out of nothing. But the path there wasn't the one the books describe. And that gap, between the story she told and the story she lived, is the final, most profound silence in Laura Ingalls Wilder's carefully constructed frontier mythology. Now you see the architecture, what she built and what she left out, the year that vanished, the poverty that got softened, the dependency she never mentioned, the marriage that started in hope and collapsed into disaster, written but never shared. Laura Ingalls Wilder created one of the most beloved visions of American pioneer life ever written. She did it by telling the truth, but not all of it. By showing hardship, but not all of it. By celebrating resilience, while hiding the systems that made resilience possible. She made choices, and those choices built a mythology so powerful it shaped how generations of Americans understood their own history. That's what we're left with. Not lies exactly, but carefully chosen truths, silences where the whole story would have been. And the question we have to ask now is, what do we do with a beloved story when we finally see the gaps? Hey guys, tonight, before we put this story to bed, I want you to do something simple. Close your eyes, unless you're driving, and picture that first image you ever had of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Maybe she's a little girl in braids and a calico dress, standing in a doorway of a log house while snow falls outside. Maybe she's riding in a covered wagon while the prairie stretches in every direction. Maybe she's sitting on the floor listening to a fiddle sing in the lamplight. Hold that image for a second, because now you know something that most readers never do. That picture you carry is real, and not real at the same time. It's built from Laura's memories, but it's also built from her choices, what she told you, and just as importantly, what she never let you see. If you strip away the sunbonnets and the television music, what did this woman really do? Between the ages of 63 and 76, on a rocky farm in Missouri, a woman with an 8th grade education turned 6 decades of lived experience into 8 books that rewired America's imagination about the frontier. She did that during the worst economic crisis of the 20th century, when publishers were cutting lists, magazines were folding, and new authors were not exactly being welcomed with open arms. She did it working by hand, in pencil, on cheap school tablets in a farmhouse bedroom. No office, no typewriter, no creative writing degree. Just discipline, memory, and sharpness that age had not managed to blunt. She did it while running a working farm, raising chickens, managing an apple orchard, keeping accounts, because royalties did not magically replace the need to put food on the table. And she did it well enough that 5 of those books earned Newbery Honor recognition from the American Library Association, more than any other author in the award's first 2 decades. So, when you hear simple farm wife who just wrote down her memories, you can let that go. Whatever else we say about omissions and mythology, this remains true. Laura Ingalls Wilder pulled off one of the most extraordinary late-life writing careers in American history. The Little House books were not written for historians. They were written for children and parents in the 1930s and early 1940s, people who were standing in bread lines watching banks fail, watching farms auctioned off on courthouse steps. Those readers were not looking for a forensic accounting of frontier failure rates. They were hungry for something else. A family that stayed together when things went wrong. A story where hard work meant something. A world where, even when winter was brutal and money was short, the centre held Laura's books delivered that. They gave readers a sense that there had been a time, whether fully real or mostly imagined, when people could face disaster without giving up their dignity. In the middle of the Great Depression, that felt like a lifeline. For girls in particular, those books did something even more specific. They offered a heroine who was allowed to be stubborn, outspoken, and practical. Laura in the books questions adults, hates itchy dresses, dislikes being confined to ladylike behaviour, and gradually claims her own competence, teaching school, handling horses, making adult decisions. For generations of American women and girls, that mattered. It was a model of girlhood that did not require passivity or sweetness to be lovable. Laura's readers saw a girl who could climb trees and argue with her father and still be the heart of the story. So, when you think about why these books lasted, it's not just the cabins and the snowstorms, it's that emotional promise. If you are odd, restless, daring, or simply tired of being told to sit still and smile, there is a place for you in this world. But every promise has a price. The cost of the Little House mythology is that it taught millions of readers that if you work hard and stay decent, you will eventually be rewarded. It downplayed how often that wasn't true. Not just for the Ingalls family, but for thousands of other families who went west and came back east broke. It framed self-reliance as a pure virtue and said very little about safety nets, about the in-laws' farm in Spring Valley that kept Laura and Almanzo from falling all the way through the floor, about the neighbours and extended kin who made survival possible. It turned Indigenous people into background figures in a white family's story, reinforcing stereotypes that would later cause real harm, and it did not fully acknowledge that the little house on the prairie stood on land taken from the Osage Nation. And it taught readers to see the frontier primarily through white settler eyes. That doesn't make the books worthless. It does mean they are incomplete. Holding both of those truths at once, that the books were a lifeline to many readers and that they left out crucial parts of the story, is uncomfortable. But it's also the only honest way to read them now. So what do you do if you love these books? If you're listening to this, there's a good chance you did. Maybe you read them under the covers as a kid. Maybe you checked them out from a school library that smelled like dust and construction paper. Maybe you read them to your own children or grandchildren, watching their faces as Pa played the fiddle and the snow fell and the lamp burned bright. You don't have to throw them away. You also don't get to pretend they're something they're not. You can let the parts that sustained you keep doing that. The warmth, the sense of family, the portrait of a girl who refused to shrink herself down. At the same time, you can talk honestly about the missing pieces. The year in Burr Oak that disappeared, the Spring Valley safety net, the realities of settler colonialism and native dispossession. The ways poverty was softened into making do. That's not betrayal. That's maturity. It's what happens when we grow up alongside the stories we loved and start asking them harder questions. And in a way, it's truer to Laura than blind nostalgia. She spent her entire writing life revising, cutting, adding, interrogating her own memories. She knew that getting closer to the truth meant being willing to reconsider what you thought you understood. After Laura's death in 1957, the story kept going without her. Her books stayed in print. In 1953, Harper had already anchored them visually with Garth Williams' illustrations, the ones that sent him travelling to Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, and Dakota to sketch the real landscapes where her childhood had unfolded. Those images became inseparable from her words. In 1954, librarians created a special one-time award to honour Laura's lifetime contribution to children's literature. They put her name on a bronze medal while she was still alive to hold it. A few years after her death, that name was attached to a recurring honour for children's authors whose work had a lasting impact. Being awarded the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award became one of the highest marks of respect in the field. Then came the television series in the 1970s and early 1980s, loosely based, cheerfully anachronistic in places, but powerful enough that for many people, Michael Landon's Pa became more real than the man who actually existed. The show layered another set of images on top of the books and introduced Laura's world to millions who never opened a page. And then, decades later, criticism caught up. By the 1990s and 2000s, scholars and readers were raising serious concerns about the series' portrayal of Native Americans and its romanticizing of settler colonialism. In 2018, the American Library Association officially renamed the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal as the Children's Literature Legacy Award, explaining that some of the content in her books did not reflect the association's current values of inclusiveness and respect. Her name came off the medal she had once been given. That doesn't erase her work. It does signal that we've reached a point where we can say, out loud and in public, what had been true all along. These books are important, influential, beloved, and they are not above critique. Laura never planned for that. She didn't live long enough to see it. But that's what happens when your work becomes part of a culture. People keep reading it, and as they change, the conversation around the work changes too. So why spend a night walking through all of this with an elderly farm wife from Missouri? Because her story forces us to challenge one of the most comforting lies in our culture. The idea that if your life doesn't follow a straight, shining path of success from youth, it doesn't count. Laura's life is the opposite of that. She did not make it in her 20s, or her 30s, or her 40s. She spent those years in unpaid labour and low-paid work, teaching school, raising a child, running a farm, may writing anonymous or near-anonymous columns for small newspapers. She fought off disasters that would have broken many people. She buried a child. She watched dreams fail. She worked herself to the edge of collapse more than once. And then, at 63, she quietly started over. She pushed a stack of tablets across a table to her daughter and said in effect, "Here, this is my life. Help me make something of it." That is not weakness. That is astonishing courage. If you're listening to this at an age where you've already had to let go of one version of your life, Laura's story should feel like a hand on your shoulder. It says, you're not finished just because the world thinks you're past your prime. The work that matters most may still be ahead of you. And if you were younger, just starting to build something of your own. Her story is a warning against easy myths. It asks you to be honest about where success really comes from. Talent, Yes, but also collaboration, safety nets, timing, and the willingness to examine your own story with both love and skepticism. Tonight, you've walked beside a woman from the moment she sharpened that first pencil at 63 to the day she died at 90, in the same farmhouse where she'd turned memory into myth. You've seen what she gave us and what she hid. You've seen the partnership with her daughter, the compromises with the market, the way personal story becomes national legend. But there's one more question we haven't answered. Not really. We've asked what Laura left out of her story. We haven't asked what you might be leaving out of yours. What would your life look like if you wrote it with the same ruthless clarity she used in Pioneer Girl? All the failures, all the safety nets, all the people who helped you when you didn't deserve it, all the choices you made because you were scared, not brave. And then, if you had to turn that into a story for someone else, what would you leave out? What would you soften? What would you mythologize? That gap between your lived reality and the version you'd be willing to share is where every human story really lives. We will leave Laura here tonight, in that upstairs room at Rocky Ridge, her pencils worn down to stubs, her pages filled, her work done. But the next time you pick up one of her books, or any book that claims to tell a true story, I want you to feel a small, quiet question tugging at you. What am I not being told? And what does that silence mean? Because once you start listening for those silences, you'll never hear stories the same way again. And in another video on another night, we're going to take that question and turn it toward a different beloved story, one you think you know just as well, and see what happens when we open the gaps in that mythology too. Sleep well, and don't get too comfortable with the stories that feel a little too perfect.